And, innovation and technology is, like radically changing our world at an ever increasing rate. And yet at the same time, absolutely nothing is changing. Nothing.
Hey, my name is Ben Charland, and you are listening to What on Earth is Going On? And that was my friend Andrew Miller, who came on the program to talk about the book Three-Body Problem by Cixin Liu, the Chinese author. Now, there are a couple of firsts on the program today. The first one is that Cixin Liu's book, Three-Body Problem, is a work of fiction. It's a novel, and that's the first time we're tackling a work of fiction on the show, so I'm really excited to do that. The second novel thing on the show is even more exciting. There is some swearing on the show. So if you're listening to the radio version, you're going to hear some bleeps. If not, you get to have a few fucks and shits thrown in there, and what could be more entertaining than that? Now, for any more information about the show, about the book that we're discussing, or to get any previous episodes of the podcast, go to www.wogopodcast.com. That's WOEGO podcast.com, and send me an email, wogopodcast@gmail.com, or reach out on social media. Give the show a like on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever thing that you use, and of course, whatever podcast app that you use, give it a rating. Without further ado, here is Andrew Miller.
All right, Andrew Miller, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thanks for being on the program. I can't wait to talk about this book with you. We're discussing a book it was written in Chinese in 2006. It's called The Three-Body Problem. And I'm going to try the name, and you can try the name. Maybe you'll do a better job of it than I will. Cixin Liu. I know that's not at all how you say it, because I've actually heard someone say it properly, but that's how you spell it in English. Cixin Liu. It was translated in English in 2014. I think in part of why that this book gained such popularity is because it was on Barack Obama's summer reading list in 2014.
No, I didn't know that.
He called it an immense and I think spectacular novel, and he said he was reading it. And then the following year in 2015, it won the Hugo Award, the first Asian piece of science fiction to win this great science fiction prize. And a lot of people have been reading this book, and it's really, in my estimation, it's true science fiction as opposed to science fantasy or a space opera in the Star Wars vein.
Yeah, absolutely. It's more in the line of the hard science fiction, similar to, say, like The Martian,
right.
Where there's, solid real world scientific concepts throughout. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely some make-believe in there.
For sure.
But it definitely has a pretty solid scientific grounding.
Yeah. It's unlike any other science fiction or fantasy I've read before in that it has very much a fantastical underpinning, but that's not where it's going with it. It's asking pretty hard questions. The other thing I wanted to say about it before we get into it is that this book, and I think I've read an interview by the author who said that, look, I'm not trying to make some kind of analogy or create some sort of canvas on which our world is mirrored. I'm just telling a story through science and through science fiction, and whatever analogies you draw are fine, but I didn't necessarily intend them. That being said, I think the purpose of our conversation today is to actually ask those questions about what the book is saying about our world today. So this conversation isn't a book review. We've done a few books on this show before. This is the first time we're doing any kind of fiction. But we're not going to talk necessarily about the plot or the characters or the development. We're not going to critique the book. We can. But the point of this is to ask, what are the questions that this book is asking, and what are the answers that maybe it's giving to those questions? But, of course, you're going to get the first question, Andrew, which is always the same. According to this book, The Three-Body Problem, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question because a lot of stuff happens in this book. I think what on earth is going on at the superficial level is the mistrust and the rejection of science, and somewhat as a allegory and allusion to social strata, the loss of sort of religious mysticism that then gets pushed back against because people feel like their framing of the world is being, overridden. Science often promotes, new ways of doing things because, the climate change, the world is in danger. We need to change our consumer habits. We need to get rid of the oil and gas industry and all of these kind of things. And a large portion of the population suddenly is like, what the fuck? You can't do, sorry, are we allowed to swear on this show?
You go ahead. I might have to bleep it for the radio version.
Okay,
but
well, yeah. I will, if I know there's bleeps involved, I'll try and tone it down a bit. But, one more time, what the fuck? Because suddenly science, this sort of mystical entity into itself, is telling us that the way that we're living is not okay. We need to, do away with our habits. We need to change who we are. We need to lose our jobs and have our financial security taken away from us, all because this thing that we can't entirely understand, especially if we're not scientists, if we're in sort of a different social strata, if we're the blue-collar working guy, this thing that we can't entirely understand is now coming in and dictating what our lives should be. And there's a pushback against that. There is a rejection of these principles. There's this conspiracy theory that springs up around it. And so in some ways, I think that is kind of what on earth is going on within this book. That's one of the, strong allegories I got. The other one really, though, like if we drill all the way down, and it's a bit of an odd one to me, because I think, obviously talking about science and everything, the world is changing and, developing at a rapid rate. And, suddenly artificial intelligence is a thing, and, predictive algorithms and personalization, self-driving cars, drones that will deliver things for Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. And, innovation in technology is, radically changing our world at an ever-increasing rate. And yet, at the same time, absolutely nothing is changing. Nothing. The underpinnings of who we are as people, the underlying reality of how we react to the world and how we engage with the world isn't changing at all. We are still a bunch of selfish assholes who crawled out of our cave, and evolutionarily, we are looking out for ourselves. And I want to stress that being a selfish asshole is not necessarily a bad thing. In order to succeed as a species, you have to have this kind of selfish drive to get out there and succeed. You have to look out for yourself. You have to have this drive to survive. And the drive to survive is inherently somewhat selfish. Even if you build it into a society which kind of looks out for each other, there is still also an aspect of looking out for ourselves before not our society. It's the us, them. It's the me, you. And so that underlying reality of who we are as human creatures persists, regardless of the technological advances. You even see it in this book. And I don't know, spoilers? Are we doing spoilers?
Oh, please, yeah. So spoiler alert, everybody. Go ahead.
Yeah, spoiler alert, everybody. There are aliens, and they're out to get us.
Which is so funny, because the backside of this book, if you get the paperback version, actually tells you that. I mean, there's a lot of things in this book that happen, and I'm lucky. I didn't read this until I didn't read the back of the book until I actually read the novel. But there are things in the back of the book where it's like, that's like 3/4 of the way through, where that's the mystery that's uncovered.
Yeah, seriously. It really needs a bunch of asterisks in all caps, spoiler alert.
Right. But I'm really glad you bring up this conflict, just to go back about the conflict between, say, science and religion, or specifically mysticism, which I find really interesting. And one show that's out, maybe it's out now, or it's still running, or it isn't running anymore, but it's with Jude Law, called The Young Pope. I haven't seen it. I don't know if you've seen it. Andrew, you're shaking your head. And I've seen scenes of it, though, and one scene is where he essentially gathers his cardinals together, and he's a young pope, I think in his 30s or 40s, from New York, from Brooklyn, and he tells them, we need to bring back mysticism to this office and to what we do. We've opened ourselves up too much. We actually now need to close down. Yeah. The opposite language that pretty much any organization in the world, whether religious or corporate or governmental, is giving today, which is to open up. They're saying close down and create a mystery to what you do. Don't show the Pope's face. Don't put the Pope's face or a king's face or a president's face on a mug or a plate. Make it mysterious, because there is power to that mystery.
So much.
And I think that's a really interesting and very clever, actually, assessment of what the book is trying to say about what the world around us is about and what's happening with it. And so there's this conflict there, but I think also, and this is again going into spoilers, which we don't have to say that anymore, because of course we're talking about the substance of the book. But the book is essentially, let me just give a really quick premise of what's going on in the book. So human beings make contact with alien civilization in the 1960s, but it's restricted to one person in China who figures it out and sends a message that essentially says, come get us.
Yeah.
Come take over our planet because we suck. We're no good. We don't deserve it. And the Trisolaran civilization in Alpha Centauri, we encourage you to come, take over, and we would be a much more hospitable planet than whatever you have in your solar system.
Yeah, the idea that how can they possibly be any worse than we are because we're terrible.
Right.
The main character at that point is, exceedingly disillusioned.
In the Cultural Revolution in communist China, which is another really important political aspect of this book that I'd like to touch upon later. But anyway, so there it essentially is the beginning of an interstellar conflict between Earth and Trisolaran civilization. Trisolaran because this planet has 3 suns, essentially, which is where the 3-body problem comes into play. That's why this is called the 3-body problem. Anyways, so this civilization is then working up plans to invade our world and take over, but that's going to be 450 years away because that's how long it takes for them to fly over here, essentially. Yeah. And on Earth, there is a movement of people who are split amongst themselves, but essentially created to bring about this change and allow them to come and either redeem us or completely eliminate us off the planet because we don't deserve to be here and to occupy this rock floating in space. But what's interesting is that the main through line of the book and the main objective of this other alien civilization is to stop our scientific development in its tracks. And in a really clever scientific way, they send 2 protons to Earth that does that because the protons are actually unfolded into their 11 different dimensions.
And this is supercomputer written onto that unfolded.
Right. Engineered and built onto these unfolded dimensions, which can actually surround a planet at a certain... Now, I'm not... you can get into the science because I'm not very good at it.
This is where it diverges maybe a little from science fiction into science fantasy because nobody really knows what the deeper dimensions would actually really manifest as. But yeah. It is definitely it's a fantastic premise.
Yeah.
This idea. I think honestly that is the single most fantastic premise in the entire book is this idea of taking a single proton and unfolding it effectively into like further dimensions, and so the physical size grows exponentially with each dimensional unfolding, and then they can actually manipulate it, basically write a computer into it, and then collapse it back to the size of a single. Yeah. It's kind of ludicrous, but also beautiful.
But what was interesting about that is that when it's brought up earlier in the book, before that's described or explained at all, they just say they're sending 2 protons over to Earth, and that's going to stop our scientific development. Yeah. And the characters go, what? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. That makes no sense. And then he goes on to explain it in a way that I never would have considered. And I think that that's really interesting. But to go back to it, again, the idea of this march of progress, which of course goes to a dialectical Marxism in China, this idea of this constant march of human progress that's going to be halted. But the other aspect of this that's interesting is that the human beings on Earth who are facilitating this invasion, if you want to call it that, become religiously motivated. They see these aliens as the Lord. They see these aliens as a higher power, which in a scientific way they are. But there is a religious fervor in the book, and there's this conflict that you brought up earlier, this conflict between religion and science, which is hinted at. We're not talking about religious wars in the book. We're not really getting into human religion, but the idea of faith and mysticism as opposed to science and empiricism, and how they can actually mash together in a really interesting congealed form.
No, for sure. I mean, I think it's a somewhat controversial idea, especially in today's march of science. But in a lot of ways, I don't actually think that mysticism and science, like empirical thought, need to be completely divorced. I think the popular idea is that those two things are effectively diametrically opposed. Like you can't have, say, religious faith and be like a true hardcore scientist. Because there's this weird faith acceptance of, unprovable, things. But no, I'm a scientist, like I'm all about, like repetitive empirical study. And it's not, obviously there are plenty of scientists out there who also have, religious faith. But I think there is a growing idea in our society that, like those two things don't really mesh. And I think that actually more comes from the religious, mostly right, pushing back against science, things like climate change again, and sort of saying, like, no, science isn't real, religion is real, and that they won't mix.
Or there's this other opinion, which is that who are you to say what's real?
Yeah.
You don't have a monopoly over what's real, and neither do I as a religious person. And I'm sorry, this is Ben putting myself in the third person, but neither of us have a monopoly over defining what's real. So who's to say that I can't say my reality is just as valid as yours, your empirical one, right?
Yeah.
And that's the debate that's going on. And of course, a scientist would say, well, no, my reality is more justifiable because I have data and I have logic and I have reason behind it. Whereas the other side just has, well, again, mysticism or superstition or whatever. Of course, it's all more complicated than this. And I think one of the divisions that we're seeing in our world today, which is maybe a little bit more long-lasting than the more proximate divisions of, say, Donald Trump and populism, is this conflict between religion and faith on the one hand, and science and empiricism on the other. And it's been going back for hundreds of years if you go back through the European tradition, and I'm sure through the Chinese tradition as well.
Absolutely. And I ultimately, at its core, I think it's kind of unfortunate because, again, I don't think those things have to be completely opposing. I do think that there is a world in which you can live where you pursue empirical evidence and truth and you invest your life in that.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, you recognize there are things that we don't understand right now. And there is a certain sort of wonder and beauty in that mysticism. We may work to figure them out and we may change, because we're committed to, empirical understanding, we can adapt our views and our engagement with that over time. But we can hold on to a degree of wonder in the here and now for those things that we don't understand.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think that those have to be so completely different. But I think that, again, with that whole us, them, selfish survival kind of thing, it's much easier to, lump yourself with like-minded.
Right.
Find narrow identities because narrow identities are easier to understand, for yourself and to project to others.
Yeah.
And, you create that separation that doesn't necessarily need to be there. It's a bit of a false premise.
Right. And these divisions, of course, are being exacerbated by social media, where we're sorting ourselves by our group and then being reinforced by our group once we're there, whether it's in a Facebook group or Twitter or whatever sphere of social media that we're talking about.
So I'm going to go on.
No, please.
I'm going to go on a tangent
Okay, go.
Because I actually think there's a really interesting potential in the pipeline with technology. And like I mentioned, artificial intelligence, machine learning, personalization before.
Yeah.
The basic concepts around like marketing and segmentation and everything, which have been prevalent for I don't know how long, but a long time, is that because we as humans have difficulty, truly understanding people, as they truly are, and it's much easier to put them into boxes. You segment your market.
Right.
You take a look at, you, Ben Charland, and I say, okay, what are some defining characteristics about you that make you similar to a large enough other group of people that it's worth focusing advertisement and effort and marketing effort upon you, but not just you, with everyone. And so I put you in a box, and I put you in a box with all these other people. And, we have limited ability to understand people, so that makes perfect sense. We have limited resources to spend on that kind of thing, so it makes sense. Now, where we're going, though, with this big data and machines that can understand at a much more nuanced level because they're completely divorced from that, and they just, it's a machine. It has capacity to find patterns and even non-patterns where, we as humans struggle. We have these opportunities to actually begin to desegment people and to truly personalize, to actually create stuff where people can begin to get engaged on a personalized level, like a real understanding of you and all of your little quirks and nuances, as long as we have the data to reflect them.
Right.
And so it's kind of a fascinating possible future where technology helps us to overcome a degree of that hyper-segmentation that we've sort of currently curved into.
Right.
And, like, as you say, like social media and stuff, it is pushing us further into certain boxes and segments and everything. But I can foresee a potential future where we actually come out on the other side of that.
This is really fascinating, Andrew, because it's giving me a thought about this too, which is that one of the debates we're having in the world today, what on earth is going on, is about democracy being in crisis, or at least liberal democracy being in crisis.
Definitely.
That maybe these two things are finally splitting away from each other. But if you only have democracy, is it sustainable? And the question that I've asked people on this show multiple times is, okay, let's just assume that all this stuff that's happening isn't as bad as we think it is. And I'm one of the people who thinks it's as bad as we think it is. But let's just for a thought experiment, take a step back and say, maybe the change that we're going through will render liberal democracy an obsolete idea, will render the current institution of our society, our politics, our government obsolete and old, and bring in something completely new, which is perhaps based on social media or the internet or the interconnectedness to people or the many-to-many communications, which has never been possible until the last 15 years or so. This incredible revolution in the way that we communicate with each other. Maybe on the other side of that, we're going to see a new world. But the problem is we're in the middle of it. We're in the middle of this transition.
Yeah, transition is the worst.
Well, and this is what's interesting to me with what you said, which is that maybe what we're moving into is that we're fragmenting closer and closer to the individual, but we're not there yet. We're currently with groups, which is where identity politics, for example, comes from. This division of politics into your group, or whether it's based on the color of your skin or your ethnic background or generally your politics. I mean, democracy today is quite polarized between those on the left and those on the right, more so than maybe any time since that data has been provided and collected. But maybe what we're seeing is fragmentation, but in a good way. And I'm going to go back to the American Revolution. James Madison, one of the founding fathers, the framers of the United States Constitution, famously said, amongst with many of the other framers, that one of the dangers to democracy, as we're building it, representative democracy, not populist mass movement democracy, but a democracy that is responsible and keeps order and maybe even privileges order over the collective will, or at least over all of these individuals, that one of the dangers is fractionalized societies and fragmentation. So they worried about the partisan politics that would eventually come with the Democrats and Republicans, or in Canada, Liberal, Conservative, NDP, or you pick a country and you're going to find a partisan divide. But what's interesting about he said was, the only way to solve this problem is to fractionalize to the extreme, because we don't want to have a unitary society where everyone has to follow the totalitarian, well, they didn't use that word at the time, but everyone has to obey the king and go into one giant mold. So the only solution that we have is to fractionalize to the level of the individual, or at least as close to that as we can get. Because if we have 3,000 different groups competing for power in the United States, none of them are ever going to succeed.
Yeah.
There's just too much diversity of opinion that no one can ever come out on top. And yet there's enough unity amongst them that there's one country formed at the end. We're in a place now, perhaps, and this is the thought experiment, are we in the place now where we're actually kind of halfway between, through the power of social media and other digital tools, between this partisan divide that was eventually evolved to, and maybe refractionalizing again to these individuals, and politics by every single person having a powerful voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think to one degree or another, we are definitely on that path. You know, the idea of everybody regaining their voice, I think that is one of the foundational realities of social media. You hear it commented on over and over again these days. You know, like that one of the biggest things that social media has done is given a voice to people who never really had a voice, particularly on a broader world stage, which is, really quite incredible. But one of the things that I find related, I was having a conversation with a friend, somebody I work with the other day. We were in the car, and we were talking about sort of the underpinning principle under which one should render a vote. It got started because we were talking about the proportional representation referendum in BC that is upcoming or ongoing right now, or recent, I don't know when, sometime in the late 2018. And we were talking about how proportional representation is also a biased system in its own way. There will never be a democratic system that does not have certain biases
Sure.
written into it.
Well, not just biases, but fundamental drawbacks depending on how you want to. I mean, if you want to create a system where there's a pretty consistent majority government in power, first past the post is effective, even if it's not efficient in the way that it represents people.
Absolutely. And proportional representation has the opportunity under some of like the sort of the subsystems, to weirdly fracture the vote, and nobody really gets majority, and then does anything get done, and
right.
So there's all these pros and cons, but the reason I bring this up, we were talking about how, like, for me personally, and this is probably really speaking to my white privilege, the fact that I make a reasonable amount of money, and I live a reasonably comfortable life, and I have a built-in advantage, is that I can afford to, and I identify with the idea of voting not solely for what I want to see, but what I think would be best for society. Now, again, it's still framed around what I think is best for society, but it's not just, I am willing to vote for things that I think would not personally benefit me, like, say, a higher tax rate, because I think they're going to be good for society as a whole, and that's where I want society to go. Mm-hmm. Now, there are other people who would look at that and say, no, the point is that you vote for what you want, that superfraction, fractal...
Right.
Sort of democracy where I'm just going to vote for myself, only what I think is best for me, but everything will probably sort of average out over the whole,
right?
Because everybody votes that way, and then the quote unquote consensus, the common points will rise to the surface, and it's interesting because as much as there's a part of me that feels like that other type of voting, you're voting only for yourself, is incredibly selfish and short-sighted and all of that. At the same time, what you're describing actually kind of reinforces that as a very reasonable mode of engagement to say, we need to bring the individual voice back into democracy. We need to say your voice matters as much as anybody else's voice, and you should vote for what is important to you as an individual, and society will kind of figure it out on the other side. And I don't know. I don't know what the right way to do it is.
Right.
I think it would be great if we all got on one side and did it the same, because I think it would have some very interesting results. But that's not going to happen. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting what you're saying, because we're talking about individualism, which is baked into, again, liberal democracy. Democracy itself, without liberalism, doesn't necessarily provide for individual rights. It provides for voting, but who gets to vote? Mm-hmm. In just democracy, if you're going to take away the word liberal from it, and of course this is the classically British word liberal, you don't maybe have women voting or slaves voting, or cut out whatever proportion of the population you want, and that is no longer the democracy that we seem to value today.
Yeah, if it's the United States, cut out the ones who disagree with you.
Sure, and this is a real problem today in our discourse about what democracy is. If 51% of the people decide that the other 49% of the people should be put to death, the only thing standing in the way of that is the liberal in liberal democracy. Democracy does not, by virtue of the definition of what it is, stand in the way of that. But the other thing I wanted to mention was this idea of having your individual voice heard, say, in an election or in public decision making, having the individual voice heard in the collective will, and having consensus come from that. And Adam Smith, of course, the same year as the American Revolution in 1776, he published The Wealth of Nations, right, which is a book that essentially says that you should pursue your personal interest, and as a result of that, and everybody else doing the same thing, the collective well-being will be improved, because we will
definitely.
because the market, as opposed to government, will sort all of these different things out, and the invisible hand will make sure these things happen okay. But what's interesting about this is that in the 20th century, John Nash, the famous mathematician and game theory, essentially said, Adam Smith, and this is a quote from A Beautiful Mind, which is a film about John Nash, where he says, Adam Smith needs revision. It's not about pursuing what you want. It's about pursuing what you want, it's about what's best for you and what's best for the group. Yeah. So when you vote, when you go into the voting booth, and by the way, this is fascinating, we're having a conversation about democracy based on a book written
about the
in a
Chinese Communist Revolution,
or non-liberal democratic country. Anyways, when you go into the voting booth, should you be thinking not just about your own interests, but also the interests of the group? Because that is the way that we maximize the the utilitarian benefit, the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
Yeah, totally. And I want to build off of that, coming back to the book, because I'm glad you kind of called out that, slight irony. I mean, obviously it's our frame of reference. Democracy is what we know. I've never lived in communism. I don't really entirely understand it. Honestly, on paper, it kind of sounds awesome. It just never really worked well.
Right. What did Winston Churchill say? It's the democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yeah. Exactly. You talk about, Nash and Smith and, this idea that democracy and capitalism are like basically Siamese twins. They're very joined at the hip. The market, the capitalist market especially, and that drive for like individual success, which is, kind of a lot of the underpinning of capitalism, is so deeply tied into like a real democratic system where, I can pursue my own capitalistic gains as a part of this democratic system. But full disclosure, I have an undergraduate degree in business and I haven't really studied history or anything. So I don't know that much about the Chinese Revolution, but what I do know...
You mean the Cultural Revolution?
Yes.
Right.
What I do know is that over time, it went from this sort of communist revolution and basically turned into capitalism. Is this other form of capitalism, sort of a
state capitalism.
Exactly. But capitalism came in there and shook things around and made things happen. And it really was a major part of the drift away from, the Little Red Cookbook. And I think that's where it becomes interesting looking at this book, because the book spans, many generations. It starts in the 60s. I can't remember when it ends, but it's relatively close to present day sort of thing.
Yeah, about that, yeah.
And if you weren't into it, you would call it insidious growth and, almost like viral spread of capitalism into the communist culture throughout the timeline of this book, and how you see, people go from, this like crazy, just anti-science, anti-capitalism, elitist strata, everything, to the China that's described, the present day China that's described in there, really doesn't feel very different than North America.
No,
in so many ways. And it's not much of a political discourse, the later part of the book. It's more just, the day to day. But it was shocking to me how similar and how recognizable China, modern day China, felt from just like a day-to-day, how people move through the world kind of way to, my own personal world and experience.
Right.
And I think, that is really down to, in so many ways, capitalism.
Well, it's fascinating that you bring up this journey, and thank you, by the way, for the segue, because I was thinking, okay, I'm going to bring it back, and I'll talk about China, but how do I get there? And you did it, so thanks, Andrew.
Yeah,
You're doing my job. So, we talk about the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s and the Great Leap Forward, which is often confused with that, which happened before the Cultural Revolution. But these two events, these really catastrophic, cataclysmic events in Chinese history, which really ripped apart the social fabric of China, deliberately so. That's what they were trying to do. And they were inherently populist in the way that we think about populism today. They were anti-elitist. They were about the people taking back power. Mao Zedong essentially shut down all of the schools in China and sent people who were, whether they were educated or they were professors or they were the intelligentsia or they were the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, they were sent to work on a farm. And then the farmers were supposed to be able to educate them in what it meant to be truly Chinese and of the working class. And of course, it was a complete disaster for the economy. But eventually, the Chinese realized in the late 1970s and especially around 1987, which led up to Tiananmen Square, 1989, they realized, okay, we need to embrace the rest of the world, especially now that the communist part of the world is starting to collapse. We really need to go with this. And one of the debates that's happening in social science today is to what extent was capitalism managed as it was brought into China, and what extent was it, as you said, was it a virus or was it viral as it kind of inhabited the China that we know? And it's hard to answer that question because on the one hand, China is really indistinct from our societies today in the West in terms of consumerism, capitalism, the way that business works, the way that you buy something. In many ways, China is more advanced. They use money in a way that is more sophisticated than almost any other society in the world, bar Sweden, where you put a chip in your hand now, where thousands of people have done this, to pay for things. And China is quite advanced in a lot of the ways that we would think of as a capitalist society being advanced. But on the other hand, everyone thought after Tiananmen Square that eventually the more well-off people would become, the more sophisticated and prosperous they would become, the more likely they would be to question the authoritarian government and eventually overthrow it, whether through peaceful or through violent means. It never happened. And today we have a China that is burgeoning, powerful, and the government is more authoritarian, more powerful than it ever was before, using capitalism in a way that democracy, as you said, the Siamese twin of democracy, used capitalism to essentially take over the world in the 20th century.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's created this dilemma in not only social science, but for our governments. There's this other alternative now that a lot of people are saying, well, maybe it's not so bad. The number of people who are in their 20s and 30s in the West who think that having a military dictatorship and that being a good idea is close to 50%.
Yeah.
There are some age groups where I think it actually is above 50%, and it's growing at all parts of the spectrum. Now, I'm not saying that China's military dictatorship. I'm saying that it's a country that provides another way of doing things as an example, and that's a dangerous one for our current system, whether we believe it or not.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can see the appeal. It's not appealing to me, but I can see the appeal, particularly if you feel betrayed by the American dream. Okay? If you feel like you're not getting, your worth. If you were told you have great promise, the world is your oyster, opportunity awaits, all you have to do is work hard, and you've basically come up empty, then, fuck this. The system sucks. This is awful. So what do you crave when everything is kind of in tatters and nothing's going the way you want? You crave, either for yourself or by proxy in somebody else, strength, authoritarianism, the will and ability to go out and reshape the world to your liking. And that's what dictatorship is in so many ways.
Right.
It's somebody coming along and saying, I have a vision. I'm going to make this right. And not only do I have the vision, but I have the will and the means to back it up.
Right.
As abhorrent and reprehensible as Hitler still is, I get it. I understand how that happened. And it's awful. But I mean, the most important thing that we can learn from, figures like Hitler in history is that they are always right around the corner. They are always a possibility. They are always an option. And even, I think more importantly, they live inside all of us. And this is where we come back to, that initial question, what on earth is going on? Absolutely nothing new. They live inside all of us. And the right opportunity, the right set of circumstances, and nobody there to, love us in the right way and hug us when we're babies and, pull us back from the edge. We all have the African warlord. We all have the, genocidal maniac. We all have the abusive father. We all have the insert, terrible person here.
Pol Pot, Stalin, Hitler,
whatever.
and all of us.
But you can also go to the smaller, like I said, like abusive father. It doesn't even have to be, the super villains of our history. It's, it's inside all of us. And, it's depressing and somewhat terrifying, but the reality is that is always an option. That is always, as I say, right around the corner.
Well, and you said by design, dictatorship is this eventuality, right? When people require and desire strength, and they vote for it, and maybe they even just make it happen. They overthrow the government or whatever. And we forget that in ancient Rome, dictators were called upon to take over in a time of crisis, for good or for bad. And there was a general sense that the dictator would relinquish power or would be defeated by a rival power so that the equilibrium of the republic would remain until, of course, it morphed into, by virtue of a dictator, morphed into the empire. And we see this play out again and again and again. And many people say that Donald Trump is a great example of this, or whatever might follow from this man who has broken so many norms that he's essentially cleared the path and made it at least culturally possible to accept someone in a position of overriding power where individual rights and democracy can, let's put that aside for a moment so we can fix these real problems or at least fight for my group. I wanted to go back, though, to talking about the rise of China in the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, and today, how precipitous that was, or at least incredible, but also how it's tied to science fiction. And this is something that I read in an interview with the author of this book, and I'm going to try to say his name again, Cixin Liu. That's how I spell it in English, totally wrong. And what he said is that in the mid-1990s, after the opening up of China, under Deng Xiaoping, I think was his name, the great leader in the 70s of China who envisioned a future that was different from what the Soviet Union was trying to do. And that it was in the mid-1990s that science fiction in China had its renaissance, that finally it took off because the tradition of utopian science fiction in the Soviet Union had no parallel in China. And it wasn't until the 1990s that it took off almost in reaction to the things that were happening, almost in reaction to this dream that China could have a much different and unique place in the world. And science fiction was a way to envision that. Mm-hmm. And this book is a way to envision that too. And so I'll give you a quote from the London Review of Books that says that this book best captures the giddying, libidinous pace of the Chinese economic boom. And it was written in 2006 in serial installments. It wasn't written originally as a novel. And
that might explain some of the pacing.
Yeah, and although this isn't a book review, I think we can both agree that the pacing is a little bit odd in this book. Maybe that's a part of the translation.
Yeah.
But it doesn't come across as what you would expect it to as a book of science fiction that you might pull off the shelf. But the question that I wanted to ask you about this is, to what extent, even though this book is set in the 1960s in some parts, and then of course it's set in this strange today, but it's not a social commentary in the way that a lot of science fiction is. It is very much sociological. It's asking what would happen if human beings came in contact with alien civilizations, and what would alien civilizations do likewise if they were in contact with us, and what would that mean? How would we react? But not with this great arrival scene that we have when aliens just arrive and we panic. It's much more slow burning than that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not an uncommon science fiction trope. There's plenty of examples of this sort of thing. I've recently been reading, I think the series is called The Expanse. It was a TV show on FX and then it got canceled and somebody else picked it up. And it was pretty good. Everybody should read it and watch it. But, similar kind of idea, like suddenly, they're aliens. We're not alone in the universe. What does that mean? How does it throw, society into disarray? Ender's Game.
Yeah.
Orson Scott Card, love him or hate him for his political and religious views, but
that was one of my favorite books as a kid. Ender's Game.
Absolutely,
yeah.
There's some really insightful, really really insightful thought experiment around, understanding true alien species and getting to sort of understand who they are, who we are, and how their relation. Like Ender's Game in and of itself is great, but the sequels like Speaker for the Dead, really get into that kind of concept of like truly understanding people to the point that you can empathize with them. And I had another, even Asimov. His Foundation series. Within that, there's like a sort of like new evolutionary branch of humanity that crops up at one point. And again, there's this like everybody freaks out and it's like, holy shit, we can't let them continue to be because they threaten our very existence and understanding of who we are as humanity. So like, it's not an uncommon trope in a lot of different ways. I like the way that it's handled here. I think that there's some really good realities around, the idea of deification of, like higher science powers and, like the celebration of that kind of like, well, we don't really know, so, let's mysticize it. The classic, magic is just science, the advanced science that we can't really understand yet kind of thing. But, and I also really like the fact here that, it kind of forms this secret society, and they're very careful with who they let in and, who they think can actually handle this truth. And, even the governments, when the governments find out about this and, start to get into the know, they're not blasting the news either. They're very like, this will not go well.
Well, and thanks again for the segue, by the way, because that fits back to the question I was trying to ask, which was this cadre of people who hold the secret and are transmitting and receiving transmissions from the alien civilization and Alpha Centauri, the Trisolarans or whatever. They remind me of a revolutionary cadre. They remind me of a group of people who are fermenting revolution, not unlike Lenin in the 1920s or the 1910s prior to the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, right? There's this group of people, this small group of people sometimes, who are advocating and building towards the great revolution and the great change in our world. And I think that for a Chinese reader who would necessarily, by their schooling, be steeped in Marxism and the history of Marxist revolution, they would see that parallel. So my question then is, through that segue, thank you again, what does this book say about China? As someone who is not Chinese, what does this book tell us about not only what is happening in China, but what China is about? Or is it purely a story that can only be seen on a humanist global level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is more of a humanist global story. Not being Chinese, it's hard to pick out, like the specific, oh yeah, I see what you did there, kind of, like that, no cultural reference kind of thing. But I really do think that it is more of a story of humanity. The author happens to be Chinese, and so the story is framed through, particularly the sort of prelude bit, in the Chinese Cultural Communist Revolution. Obviously that's framed in that way. But I really don't think that this is a cultural tale.
No, I don't think it is either. I guess I'm just asking, was there any part of it that you thought, this is telling me something about China that I didn't know before, whether the Chinese psyche or Chinese science fiction, Chinese society, I don't know. And
I think, basically, as I said before, I was surprised how recognizable it all was. Mm-hmm. China is not somewhere that I've traveled. I've traveled other sort of tangentially, related areas, but China is not somewhere that I've been. And I expected it to feel more alien. And maybe it's the way it was translated really well, but I was somewhat shocked by how comfortable and recognizable, and there wasn't like a lot of places in the book where I was like, oh, that's weird. It just it just fit.
So second to last question is about virtual reality. One of the key components of this book is VR. There's a game in this book called The Three-Body Problem. And I don't know if you know this, but Amazon's developing a TV show based on this series.
I actually just learned that.
So this is the first of a trilogy. I think the other books are called The Dark Forest is the second one, and the third one's called Death's End.
Yeah, I haven't got to reading them yet. But
And so Amazon is already committed, I think, up to $1 billion to develop this into a TV series. And I'm almost certain that the main way in for this TV series, when it finally comes out, 3 years from now or whatever, will be virtual reality. I'm just convinced. I know that's just the easiest way that anyone could have described this book, is that there's a game. Just imagine there's a game that people are playing, and you have to figure out this problem in physics, which is today remains a mathematical problem that people can't solve when you bring in quantum mechanics. If you have three bodies in space, so three suns, or even the Earth, the moon, and the sun, for example, are an aspect of the three-body problem. If you know their position and their velocity, can you predict where they will go for the rest of time? And the answer is no, we can't predict it yet because we haven't solved the problem. But the question that is posed in this virtual reality game, which is a proxy for the religious Trisolaran Adventists or whatever they're called, if you can solve the problem in the game, you win the game. But what are your thoughts on VR, on virtual reality in this book?
it stretches a little too, or I wouldn't even say it stretches so much as it's really lean on a few critical details to explain how the system would actually work. I mean, I've played with VR a bit. I'm super excited and fascinated by it. Like when I get some money, I will definitely buy one. I'm really stoked on the fact that VR is finally becoming a reality. I mean, I'm old enough, like I'm just the right age bracket to remember when Nintendo put out a VR system back in like the late 80s, early 90s, and it was horrible. Like it was the worst thing in the world. But there was this promise of what VR could be, and this idea of like fully immersive experiences, and we're like basically there now. It's still a bit expensive. There's bugs to be worked out. It's going to get better, etc. But like, it's kind of real. There's a lot of limitations. And like the book, very briefly describes like haptic feedback suits and, all of this. And, there's all of this stuff, like he's walking around and he's feeling, like all of these heat and emotion and just, like everything. And, like it's a little lean on how exactly the system would,
Right.
allow for that. But it's not that far-fetched. Mm-hmm. And it's super exciting to think about being able to use a system like that, because as you say, like it is a bit of a it's a bit of a video game. It's also a bit of a teaching tool. Mm-hmm. It's basically teaching the uninitiated about the Trisolaran society, culture, and evolutionary
propaganda
path. Yeah, absolutely. And kind of like getting them excited about who these aliens could be and what their what their culture could be.
Get excited for the alien invasion, everybody.
Yeah, exactly, because they're going to save us from everything,
including ourselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, is that not the basis of all effective religious faith? Other people will save us
from ourselves.
Yeah.
What is the end game of almost every religion but to eradicate our own bodies? Yeah.
But yeah, I think VR is super exciting, super fascinating. I think it absolutely is going to continue to grow and develop. And I do think that it is going to become a relatively adopted technology. That said, I think AR, augmented reality, is the one that's really going to go somewhere. Because,
So describe, what is that, augmented reality?
So in VR, you are completely inside. You only see what it shows you, and you're like blocked off from the rest of the world. It's a completely immersive experience. Augmented reality is basically, you think about like a heads-up display in a fighter jet. It's an overlay where it adds additional detail to whatever it is that you are interacting with and looking at in the world. The best example in
Pokemon Go.
Well, yes, in terms of like practical, that is effectively augmented reality. You point your phone camera somewhere and it shows you something that isn't really there, and you can interact with it. If you want to go, a little more of the science fiction, science fantasy, Iron Man, from the Marvel cinematic universe, everything that he's seeing, there's all of these overlays, additional information, like he's voice in the head, that's telling him all of this extra stuff.
Right.
That's where we're trying to go.
Right.
We're trying to go that when I look at you, whatever is displaying in my eyes is pulling up your social media profile, and it's letting me, know some critical things about you. And,
Right.
Then I look over there and I see, I'm at the grocery store and I look at that apple and it tells me, where it's from, how much it costs, what I could cook with it.
Well, moreover, I think it can also, if you look at me, you might see a beautiful face that I don't actually have, right?
For sure,
so
that's
there's
possible.
A great scene in Blade Runner 2049, the new Blade Runner, where he, the main character played by Ryan Gosling, sits down to have a meal, and the meal looks like a bunch of cables in a bowl.
Yeah.
But he looks at it, and it looks like a delicious meal.
Absolutely.
This overlay. But what's interesting about what the director did in that film is that it's very clearly augmented and almost fuzzy and staticky. So he knows it's not real, and it's almost trying too hard to be. You might as well just eat the gross cables.
No, totally.
Anyways, it's not just a like a Terminator 2 or Terminator overlay on your world. It can also change the way things look around you. It can augment and alter your reality too.
Yeah, the possibilities are frighteningly exciting. Yeah, in that way, they can definitely go so many different places. But I mean, I think that coming back to the sort of core of the question, VR within the book, and its purpose, utility, and importance. I think as a education tool, as an experiential opportunity to engage with a world that doesn't truly exist and to learn from that, I think is super fascinating. I read a lot more fiction than I read nonfiction. And one of the reasons that I do is, for me personally, I'm always very interested in, sort of like explorations of like the human condition, sort of who we are as humans, and, like how people respond to circumstance and interact and like look at themselves, look at the outside world, how other characters look at them, that sort of thing. And those are stories and those are points that are really, in my humble or not so humble opinion, best made through fiction. Because if you're writing nonfiction, then you are restricted to reality. You are restricted to what is actually known, what actually happened. You don't know what that person truly thought. You're, creating some supposition, but you're still restricted in that supposition around, like what is real. In fiction, you can go anywhere. Especially like science fiction, fantasy. You can make up, aliens. You can make up, magical creatures, basically to explore these themes and to...
But what's interesting, I think, so much about fiction, especially science fiction and fantasy, is that those are always a reflection of reality, because we cannot obviously escape who we are and what we know and our history and our memory and our language. And so we can go as far as we possibly can to create something that's totally crazy and literally out of this world. And yet it is always, always analogous to our world, because that's the nature of what it is to create and have an imagination. Yeah. Last question, Andrew, because we're getting to the end of our time. And this question is courtesy of your betrothed, your wife-to-be, your fiancée.
She has good ideas.
It was actually a really good idea, and I'm thinking that I'm going to use it at the end of every show as my last question, which is, if you were to ask any other person the question that we're asking today, what on earth is going on, who would that be?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this the entire time, and I can only come up with dead people. So I
hope
you accept a dead person.
There are no rules.
But I think the person that I would be most fascinated and I would love to be able to have a conversation with about what on earth is going on would actually be Anthony Bourdain.
Huh.
Such an interesting human being. Traveled to so many corners of the world, has experienced so many different cultures, experienced them in a way that I'm incredibly passionate about, which is food and, the culinary culture, which I think is, honestly one of the premier ways to experience and engage in a culture. You want to know who people are as a culture. Don't just eat their food, but learn how it's prepared.
And who they've been for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
Totally. Yeah. Also just, he's a fascinating person with, unique perspective and, great narrative and, beautiful charisma and all of that. But then at the same time, especially now knowing how he passed and knowing, the sort of the darkness that he carried with him, the depression and the struggle, and the humbling effects of mental illness, even on the, in many ways effectively super elite. He's a TV superstar. He's rich. He traveled all over the world. He did things that most of us only dream of, and, the experiences that we would kill for, and yet carried mental illness with him everywhere that he went. And it finally, kind of overcame him. It overcame him. I would love to be able to sit down with him and have this conversation. What on earth is going on? And not just, Tony as an American, no. What on earth? Globally, the whole thing, everything that you've seen, every culture that you've experienced, every corner of the world that you've been to, what is going on, man? I would love to be able to have that conversation with him.
Cool. Well, Andrew, it's been a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for
doing
this.
It's been a pleasure.
That's the conversation this week. For more information about the book, go to the website, wogopodcast.com. That's WOEGO podcast.com. You can get all previous episodes at the same place and links to social media where you can also connect with me. Also send me an email, wogopodcast@gmail.com, with your suggestions for future episodes. Your quote of the week is from the book, Three Body Problem, and it goes like this. Is it possible that the relationship between humanity and evil is similar to the relationship between the ocean and an iceberg floating on its surface? Both the ocean and the iceberg are made of the same material. That the iceberg seems separate is only because it is in a different form. In reality, It is but a part of the vast ocean. Thanks for tuning in.